and welcome to our webinar on the Quantitative Methodology chapter. Just before we begin the presentation, I'd like to present this information in case you are interested in additional services outside of this webinar. So we do provide full assistance with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you do need more one-on-one help outside of this webinar, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the types of assistance that we provide. And first, I'll just start by going over what we will be covering in the presentation today. So today's presentation will be on the quantitative methodology chapter. So we will not be covering qualitative methodology today. We have other webinars that cover that topic. And first, we'll just talk about the importance of the methodology chapter and the purpose it serves in the dissertation. And then the bulk of the discussion will be about the different components of the methodology chapter. So the introduction, research methodology and design, talk about the population and sample, instrumentation, data collection and analysis procedures, limitations and ethical considerations. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. So at the end of the presentation, you can feel free to type your questions into the questions section. And any questions that aren't answered over the course of the presentation, we will answer those during the question and answer session at the end. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the methodology chapter and why it's important to the dissertation. So the methodology chapter will describe how you are going to be conducting your research. The previous chapters of the dissertation, namely the introduction and literature review chapters, focus on why you are doing your research. It establishes the need for your research and why the research needs to be done. Once you get to the methodology, you start to talk about how you are going to conduct your research. So how you are going to do the research that will answer your research aims and your research questions. And so the methodology should be detailed enough so that someone could read your methodology chapter and be able to replicate your research. The purpose is to be able to make basically like a set of instructions that someone could follow to be able to replicate your research. So you can think of the methodology chapter almost like a instruction manual that you are providing that other researchers can read so that they could conduct the same study if they wanted to. Others will liken the methodology chapter to a recipe where it has different components such as the participants and the instrumentation. And you have to put those components together, describe what the components are, and then talk about the different steps for implementing the research, putting those things together and coming up with a plan for conducting the study. And although today we're going to be talking about the sections that are most typically required for the methodology chapter based on our experience with many different schools, you should always defer to your specific school's guidelines to determine exactly what needs to go in your methodology chapter. So some schools will have different requirements. Some schools may have fewer sections than what we talk about. Some schools may have more sections that they want than what we talk about today. So you do want to make sure that you check the specific requirements for your school or degree program to make sure that you are following what that program requires. So now let's talk about the different components of the chapter. And like most other chapters in the dissertation, the methodology chapter may begin with an introduction section where you reorient the reader to the purpose of your study and your research questions, and just give an outline of the different sections that will appear in your chapter. So when you restate your problem or purpose statement, this can be restated verbatim as it appears in your previous chapters, or it can be an abridged or abbreviated version of your problem or purpose statement. Really, the purpose is just to reorient the reader to your study. Then for the research questions and hypotheses, you want to state these verbatim exactly as they appear in other sections of your paper. This is important to note because everywhere your research questions and hypotheses appear in your document, they need to be consistent. So the wording should not change wherever they appear in the document. And then you can simply go over the sections that the chapter will cover by listing out the different sections that will appear in the methodology chapter. So one of the first sections that will appear in the methodology chapter is the rationale for the research design. So in this section, you want to discuss the specific research design that you have chosen and provide justification for why that is the best design for answering your research aims. It's worth noting that depending on your school's requirements, you may also be required to talk about the more general research method, which would be the choice of quantitative versus a qualitative or a mixed method study. And often these come in two distinct sections. But just note that if you're required to talk about the general methodology, the approach should be the same as it would be if you were discussing just the research design. But for the research design, you first want to state the specific design that you've selected. So within quantitative research, this may be a correlational design, experimental design, quasi-experimental or causal comparative, or just some examples. And you want to discuss in detail why that design was selected. So in other words, why is that the most appropriate design to use based on your problem, purpose, and research questions? So for instance, if you are doing a correlational design, perhaps you selected that design because the purpose of your study and your research questions have to do with looking at relationships between variables rather than comparing groups of participants. That would be a way to align the research design with your research questions and purpose. In addition to explaining why you chose the design that you selected, you may also need to discuss other designs and explain why you did not select those designs. So if you picked correlational, then you may also want to briefly discuss experimental, quasi-experimental, and causal comparative designs and talk about why those designs were not appropriate for your study. And again, if you're also required to talk about the general methodology and the justification for choosing a quantitative approach, you'll want to talk about specifically why you chose quantitative and also talk about why you did not choose a qualitative approach. So next, let's talk about the population and the sample. And this is where a lot of students can get confused in terms of distinguishing between these two, but these are two different concepts. So the population is the broader group of individuals or people that the results of your study are intended to generalize to. So for instance, if you're doing a study in education and you plan on surveying teachers, then perhaps your population of interest is high school teachers in the United States. Or maybe your population is more specific based on your problem and purpose. Maybe it's high school teachers in a specific region, or high school teachers that teach a specific subject area like math or science, or teachers that teach special education. That would be your general population. And so you want to state the population of interest. So, it might just be high school teachers in the United States. And then you want to describe the specific characteristics of the population and provide an estimate of the population size if that is possible for you to do. So if your population is high school teachers in the United States, you may want to provide an estimate for how many high school teachers there are in the United States. You might get this type of information from a source such as the Bureau of Labor Statistics or other source that provides data and statistics on these types of things. It might not be possible for you to know the exact size of the population, but you want to try to estimate it as best as you can. Now, the population is different from the sample because the sample is just those individuals from the population who actually end up participating in your study. So you can think of the difference between the population and sample in terms of a fishing analogy. So let's say that you plan to go to a lake to go fishing, but chances are when you do that, you're probably not going to catch every single fish in the lake when you go fishing. You might be lucky to catch just a few fish. So you can think of all of the fish in the lake as the population, and the few fish that you actually catch are your sample. And so going back to our education example, your sample is just the high school teachers that you recruited from the population who actually participate in your study. And so for the sample, you'll want to describe your specific sampling strategy or technique. So general sampling strategies can include random sampling and convenience sampling. So random sampling, or more generally probability sampling, would mean that you are randomly choosing individuals from the population to participate in your study. And this type of sampling generally gives the best generalizability for your results. However, it may not be feasible for you to randomly sample from your population. So if your population is high school teachers in the United States, you're probably not going to be able to get a complete random sample from that entire population, because random sampling means that every individual in the population has an equal chance of being selected into your sample. And that's generally not something that students are able to accomplish in a dissertation study. So it's more likely that you'll be using some type of non-probability or convenience sampling. And this would mean picking individuals from the population who are convenient and accessible to you. So in this case, or in our education example, you might pick high school teachers from schools in your local region, or maybe you will pick teachers who are members of a specific teaching organization or association, because that association may have a list of members and contact information that would make it convenient for you to approach and contact those people and invite them into your study. That would be an example of a convenience sample. But regardless of what type of sampling strategy you use, in your methodology chapter, you'll want to describe in great detail how the sample is going to be selected from the population and recruited into your study. So how are you going to select those teachers from the population? Are you going to just be going into local schools to ask teachers to participate? And if so, how are you going to do that? Will you have their contact information from a school administrator, like a list of email addresses, or will you be posting flyers at the school or some other type of advertisement to recruit people into your study? Or are you going to some organization like a teaching association and getting email addresses from a member list? So you want to describe in detail how you are going to be selecting potential participants. And you also want to state your target sample size. And for quantitative studies, this involves using power analysis. So in a power analysis, you would calculate the appropriate sample size, or so in other words, how many participants you need for the specific statistical analysis that you will be doing. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about power analysis in this presentation because we do have other webinars that specifically discuss power analysis and sample size calculation. So if you are interested in that topic, I would direct you to those more specific webinars. So now let's talk about the instrumentation. So the instrumentation refers to the specific methods that you'll be using to measure each of the variables in your study. So you may be doing some type of study that involves survey instruments. So perhaps you have a survey instrument that can measure something like self-efficacy or self-esteem or qualities of leadership. But you may have other types of measurements depending on your study. So if you're doing something like a biomedical study where you have measurements of things like height, weight, blood pressure, and other physical assessments, then you might have specific instruments that measure those types of things, like specific blood pressure monitors or scales to measure weight. So those can be instruments as well. And so you want to make sure that you describe each instrument that will be used to measure the variables of interest in your study. So you want to make sure by the end of the instrumentation section, you have covered all of the variables that are listed in your problem, purpose, and research questions, and make sure that you have included an instrument to measure each one of those. So for things like survey instruments, you will want to describe how many items or questions it has, what the response scale is. So for instance, do people rate the items on a Likert scale, like from strongly disagree to strongly agree, like a 1 to 5 or a 1 to 7 scale, or are they responding in some kind of a different way? And then you also want to talk about the scoring. So if an item has multiple, or if an instrument has multiple questions or items, how are you going to score those items and create a variable for use in your analysis? So are you going to add all the responses together? Or are you going to average the responses? So how are those scores computed? And you'll also want to talk about the validity and the reliability of each instrument. So for survey instruments, this typically involves talking about the previous research that has been done to develop that instrument. For validity, this might involve describing the results of a factor analysis that was done by the original instrument authors to talk about validity. And for reliability, these might be things like Cronbach's alpha coefficients or test-retest correlations to test for reliability. And again, you would find this information in the original articles that describe how the instrument was developed and tested initially. And it's also worth noting that validity and reliability sometimes have their own separate sections from the instrumentation, depending on your specific school's requirements. So you want to double check those requirements and see if your school has separate sections for validity and reliability. Then after you talk about the instruments, you can start talking about the data collection procedures. And this is really one of the most important sections of the methodology, because here is where you're going to talk about step by step how you are going to be conducting your study, how you're going to be collecting your data. And again, thinking back to our instruction manual or recipe approach, you want this to be as detailed as possible. It should be detailed enough so that someone else could read your methodology chapter and be able to conduct the study in the exact same way that you did. So you'll want to talk about things such as where and how the data collection is going to take place. So if you're doing a survey study, for instance, are you going to be conducting the surveys in person? So actually going out to a location where the participants will be and giving them paper and pencil surveys, or maybe you're doing an online survey where participants can just complete the survey from their own computer on their own time. But if so, how are you going to distribute those online surveys to the participants? Are you going to send it to them through email or through some other means? You'll also want to talk about how participants will be provided informed consent. So that's an important part of the study where you give participants information about the study so that they can make an informed decision about whether they should participate or not. So you'll want to talk about how they're going to be given consent. And you'll talk about also how and when each instrument will be administered. So if you're administering several different survey instruments, in what order are you giving those instruments, and when exactly are you administering the instruments? That's especially important if you're doing a longitudinal or repeated measure study, such as a pre-test, post-test study, where you're administering the instruments at different points in time. You want to be very specific in that case about when exactly the instruments are being administered and how many times they're being administered and so on. Now, everything I've described so far has pertained to primary data collection, where you will be the one contacting participants and collecting primary data. But sometimes you may be doing a study that involves secondary data, where other researchers have already collected data and you are using that data for a different analysis. In cases where you're using secondary or archival data under the data collection procedures, you want to talk more about how you are accessing that data. So it may be that you're getting the data from a specific organization or data administrator, and you have some kind of steps where you have to contact that organization or data administrator in order to get permission to use the data. In that case, you just want to describe that process in as much detail as you can. So that's how you would incorporate data collection procedures if you are doing an analysis of secondary data. Once you've covered the instrumentation and data collection procedures, you can then talk about your data analysis plan. So in your methodology, you will want to establish, before you even do your study and do your data collection, how you plan to analyze the data. You want to be able to put forth a specific plan for what statistical analysis you're going to do to answer your research questions. So this can start with how you are going to compile or enter your data into an electronic format. This is especially important if you're collecting physical data such as paper and pencil survey data, because if you do that, you're then going to have to manually enter that data into an electronic format so it can be analyzed. So you'll want to describe that process if it's applicable. You'll want to state the software that you're using for data cleaning procedures and analysis. So software could include something like SPSS, or we have our own software in Instrumentation Statistics. You just want to state which software that you're using. You want to describe the specific steps that you take for cleaning and preparing the data for analysis. So this can involve checking the data for accuracy, checking for outliers, and going over missing data. So checking for accuracy is especially important if you have to manually enter the data into electronic format. So you want to check and make sure that the responses are entered accurately. And checking for missing data is important because it's very likely that you will have some missing data and you'll need a plan for how you're going to deal with it. So For instance, are you going to just leave out any person that has any missing responses? Or are you going to try to include people that have missing responses, but deal with their missing values in some way, such as a mean replacement or an imputation, or some other method for dealing with their missing data? You'll want to discuss specifically how you plan to deal with missing responses. After you've gone over the data preparation procedures, you'll want to talk about any descriptive statistics that you'll conduct. So this can involve conducting descriptives for any demographic information you collect, just to give the readers a sense of the characteristics of your sample, as well as descriptive statistics for your main variables of interest. And then you'll want to talk about the analysis that you're going to conduct to answer each of your research questions or hypotheses. So you'll want to kind of organize this part of it by your specific research question. So you'll want to talk about, for each research question or hypothesis, what analysis you are going to conduct to answer that specific research question. So for instance, you might conduct something like a t-test or an ANOVA if your research question involves comparing groups of participants on a certain variable. So you'll want to state what your variables are for each analysis. So what are your independent and dependent variables if you're doing something like a t-test or an ANOVA? Or if you're doing something like a regression analysis, what are your predictor variables and what's your criterion variable? And you'll want to discuss the specific statistics that you will compute and report as part of that analysis. And for each analysis that you are conducting to answer your research question, you'll also want to describe how you're going to test the assumptions for each analysis. So things like t-tests and ANOVAs and regressions all have certain statistical assumptions that need to be met in order to be interpreted accurately. So you'll want to describe each of the assumptions that are required for each analysis and describe how you are going to test each of those assumptions. And you'll also want to talk about what you're going to do if any of those assumptions are violated. So for instance, if you're planning to do a t-test or an ANOVA, you may have to test the assumptions of normality and homogeneity of variance. So you'll want to describe exactly how you're going to test normality, how you're going to test homogeneity of variance, and then what you're going to do if normality or homogeneity of variance are violated, which might involve conducting an alternative non-parametric test or doing some kind of transformation to the data to make the data normally distributed. So one of the last sections that may appear in the methodology chapter is the limitations. And this differs from the limitations that you might discuss in the earlier chapters of your dissertation, because in the methodology chapter, you want to focus on limitations specific to the research design that you have chosen. So there are certain limitations that are associated with specific research designs and maybe even your specific data collection procedures. So for instance, for correlational studies, a primary limitation might be that you cannot determine cause and effect. In survey studies, you might have to deal with things like response biases, such as social desirability bias or selection bias. In comparative studies or longitudinal studies like pre-test, post-test studies, you may have to deal with limitations such as attrition, testing effects, history, or maturation. And in experimental studies, you may want to discuss limitations due to external validity, which has to do with the generalizability of the results of your experiment to more real-world contexts. So you'll want to talk about the limitations that are specific to your research design. And if possible, what are you going to do to potentially mitigate those limitations? So for instance, in a survey study where a possible limitation is response bias, you could say that you're going to try to mitigate that limitation by ensuring the participants that their responses are confidential or anonymous, so that they'll be more likely to provide honest responses. And then again, one of the last sections that appear in the methodology chapter are the ethical considerations. So this is where you talk about all of the ethical issues that are relevant to your research study and how you are going to protect the rights and data of your participants. So often schools will want you to discuss the Belmont Report and the specific principles of the Belmont Report, which outline guidelines for conducting ethical research. And so the main principles of the Belmont Report include beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. And you may need to discuss each of those principles and how you plan to uphold or follow each of those principles in your study. You'll also want to talk about institutional review board or IRB approval. So in basically any research study, you'll need some kind of an approval from an institutional review board in order to conduct your research. And so you'll want to talk a little bit about that process and the fact that you will be getting IRB approval before you collect any data. And you'll also want to talk about informed consent. You may have talked about this in a previous section, but you may also talk about this in the ethical considerations. So talk about how participants will be given informed consent and how participants will provide informed consent. You also want to talk about any risks involved in your study. And a lot of students will make the mistake of saying that their study involves no risk, but this isn't really true because pretty much every research study involves some risk. It's just that maybe your study involves minimal risk. So for instance, if you're doing something like basic survey research or an online survey, then that would probably be a minimal risk study, which just means that the risks are no greater than what people would normally encounter in their day-to-day life if they weren't participating in the study. But even if your study only has minimal risk, you do want to describe how you are going to mitigate any possible risk and protect participants from harm. But this becomes more important if you're doing a study that involves more than minimal risk. So for instance, if you're doing biomedical research, or you're doing some kind of experiment that involves a treatment where participants could actually experience something like physical, emotional, or psychological harm. In those cases, you'll want to describe the specific risks that you expect that participants may encounter in your study and what you're going to be doing to mitigate those risks as much as possible. You'll also want to talk about how participants' identities and information will be protected. This applies to pretty much any primary data collection study. So, for instance, are you collecting data anonymously, which would mean that you're not collecting any personally identifying information, or are you collecting personal information and you need to keep that information confidential? If so, how are you protecting that information? How are you protecting the data that you collect from participants? So, for instance, if you're collecting data electronically through an online survey, how is that data going to be stored and protected? Are you storing it in encrypted cloud storage? Or are you storing it on a password computer? And after the study is over, how is the data going to be destroyed? So different schools will have different guidelines or requirements for how long they expect students to keep the data after it is collected, and how the data should be destroyed after that period is over. So you'll want to look at your school-specific guidelines if they have any for that aspect of the data management. And so that brings us to the end of the presentation on the different components of the methodology chapter. Again, if you're interested in more one-on-one help, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the different types of assistance that we provide. But now I'll go ahead and get to the question and answer section of the presentation. So if you do have a question, you can feel free to post that in the questions section now, and I'll do my best to answer your question. Now I'll go ahead and see if we have any questions so far. And let's see. So one question is, how do you approach describing population and sample in a dissertation proposal? So in your proposal, you just want to describe the population and sample that you plan to collect from. So going back to our example in education, maybe you're doing a study on teachers. If so, you might be looking at a specific group of teachers. So maybe teachers at the university level, teachers at the high school level, or the elementary school level. Maybe that will be general to teachers all across the United States, or maybe your population is more specific to a region or to a specific subject matter like math or science. So whatever the actual population of interest is, and that'll depend on your specific research questions and the problem and purpose that you're trying to address in your study, you want to make sure those things align. So you want to make sure that your stated population aligns with your problem, purpose, and research questions. And then for your sample, you can't really describe the specific sample before you actually collect the data, because you haven't collected the sample yet. But in terms of talking about the sample, you want to talk about how you are going to recruit people from the population to be in your study. So how you are going to sample from that population, what's your sampling strategy going to be? And you also want to talk about the sample size. So what sample size do you aim to collect? And that should be based off of a power analysis. And to get to another question, that is, for power analysis, will it be the same if you're using secondary data? The answer to that would generally be yes, because the power analysis is usually based on the specific statistical analysis that you plan to conduct. So whether it's primary data or if it's secondary data, the sample size calculation is going to be based on what specific statistical analysis you plan to conduct on those data. Right, and another point says, quick note, how you will or how you did, because ideally you are describing what you already did. Unless it's for a proposal, then you'll be describing how you will. This is a good point, is that if you're in the proposal phase, then your methodology chapter is generally going to be in future tense. So you're going to be describing how you will be doing these things. Eventually, once you get past the proposal phase and you move into the later phase of your dissertation, when you've actually collected the data, then you probably will be going back and putting your methodology chapter into past tense. So you will have done those things already. And so then at that point, you will be describing what you did rather than what you're going to do. So that's a good point in terms of the language that you use in the methodology chapter. If you're in the proposal phase and you haven't conducted the study yet, you're probably going to be writing that in future tense. But if you've already conducted the study and already collected the data, then you're probably going to be writing that in past tense. And so let's see if we have another question here. How do I discuss closed-ended study? It will be a questionnaire that is not already tested. So generally at the dissertation level, you're going to want to use questionnaires that have already been validated by previous researchers if you're doing a survey study. Because usually creating your own instrument or questionnaire to measure a certain variable can be a dissertation in and of itself. Most schools will not want you to try to create your own instrument. And in fact, a lot of schools prohibit you from doing that. So that's something to keep in mind. But if you do have to create your own instrument for your study, then part of your methodology section will be describing how you're going to validate that instrument. So going back to the section on validity and reliability, if you're using already validated instruments, then you'd be describing the evidence for validity and reliability that has already been established by other researchers. But if you have to create the instrument yourself, then that means you have to describe what tests you're going to do and what procedures you're going to follow to establish the validity and reliability of your instrument. So depending on if that's what you're going to do, then that's how that part of the methodology chapter would need to change. And let's see, another question is, so question, can you help in reviewing if the econometric method I'm using is appropriate for the research study? I direct you to the information that you see on the screen here if you want more specific one-on-one help with your project. So if you want specific help on your project and finding out if the methods that you plan to use are appropriate, we do provide help in that area. So you can use our contact information here to talk about your needs and how we can help you with that. And let's see, another question here is it acceptable to choose a group of students to test? It depends on what exactly you're doing, but that might be a form of convenience sampling. So, and when we talked about the population and the sample and different sampling strategies, it may not be possible for you to get a true random sample from your population. It's often just not feasible to be able to do that. So that's why for dissertation level studies, students will often resort to some type of non-probability or convenience sampling, where maybe if you're studying students, your population is, a certain population of students, maybe it's high school students, middle school students, university students, whatever the case may be, you may need to do some kind of non-probability sampling from that population. If it's at the university level, maybe you're just sampling students from your particular university or local universities that are convenient for you to access, for instance. So those types of sampling methods are generally acceptable. They are not as powerful as random sampling, not as generalizable as random sampling, but it's usually understood that at dissertation level research, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to get a true random sample from your population of interest. So you may have to collect some kind of convenience sample. And if that was in reference to choosing a group of students to test to validate a questionnaire, um, that may be part of the process that you use to validate a questionnaire. So typically you would have to go through something like a pilot test or a pre-test of your survey, or maybe even do multiple rounds of data collection to validate your instrument. And so that can be part of it, where you choose a sample, or you collect a sample from your population for the purposes of validating your questionnaire or the research instrument that you're trying to develop. All right, it looks like those were all of the questions that have been presented so far. So if anybody has any other questions, I'll give another minute or so for you to enter those questions in now. So question is, how do you check that your questions and analysis match? So this is a good point, that you want to make sure that your proposed statistical analyses align with your research questions. So, and we have other webinars that go more in depth on research questions and choosing appropriate analyses. But in general, if you are dealing with research questions that have to do with relationships between variables, or prediction, or things of that nature, you're probably going to be doing some type of a correlation analysis, like a Pearson correlation, or if you're doing prediction, you might be doing an analysis like regression. If your research questions involve comparing groups, so for instance, if you're doing an education study, you might be comparing groups of students on a certain outcome, like self-esteem, or their academic achievement in some area. If your purpose is to compare groups, then your analysis might involve something like a t-test or an ANOVA. So you do want to make sure that the specific analysis that you choose does align with the research questions and the aims of your study. But again, we have other webinars in which we discuss how to construct proper research questions, and how to choose specific statistical analyses. So if you're more interested in that topic, I would direct you to those webinars. And also, again, if you're interested in more one-on-one help in that area, that's something that we also provide assistance with. If anybody else has any other questions, you can feel free to enter those into the question section now. Okay. Doesn't look like any more questions are coming in, so I'm going to end the presentation there for today. I do thank everyone for attending the webinar today. I hope everyone found it useful. And again, if you are interested in additional support, you can use the information here to contact us, or you can look at our other available webinars if you're interested in other topics. So again, thanks everyone for attending today, and I hope everyone has a great day.